What I'm going to be talking to you about is about workforce disability within the NHS. Now, I've been working in HR, organisational development, for over about 20 years. And reflecting back on my 20 years, I was thinking, when have I had that blue light, bulb moment, thinking, well, I'm having a real impact in terms of people management or the equality agenda. And I look back to 2008 in particular, when I worked alongside Professor Carol Baxter and also Professor Uchibong from University of Bradford, where we looked at disciplinaries and the impact on BME staff in the NHS. And what we found was BME staff were 2.5 times more likely to end up in a disciplinary than their white counterparts. And what that actually did was it actually provided the evidence, in a sense, that the NHS needed to undertake some real concerted work around this particular area. Subsequently, what we had was the Workforce Race Equality Standard that was published, and now organisations, and on an annual basis, they've got to report on the experiences of BME staff within the NHS on an annual basis, both from a recruitment perspective, but also in terms of disciplinaries, grievances and representation. Then in 2012, alongside my line manager Paul Deemer, we asked Disability Rights UK to do a similar exercise, but this time involving disabled staff within the NHS. And we were not sure exactly what the response would be. So we asked Disability Rights UK to do a questionnaire. And as researchers will know, often when you do questionnaires, it's really difficult to get a good return on questionnaires. So we were not really sure. So as a team, we thought, well, if we get about 100, 200 potentially, we'll be happy. We actually got 1,100 responses in the period of 2 months. And that was with very little in the way of using marketing communication tools. And what that told us was a fantastic insight into the experiences of disabled staff within the NHS. This morning, I think Simon and a few others mentioned, to really find out about what's going on in terms of the shop floor, as we call it, you've got to engage with staff. And what we found out was something really, really difficult to digest at times, the real experience of disabled staff within the NHS. So what I'm going to share with you is 2 pieces of research. First of all, one was which was very much qualitative in nature, and secondly, work we asked University of Bedfordshire to do to give us a real insight into what is the experience of disabled staff and what do we need to do. So as handouts, I've given you 2 pieces. One, which looks at some of the key findings of the qualitative research, but secondly, also in terms of what was one of the products of the 2 pieces of work to enable the NHS on an annual basis measure impact. Because as you'll know better than I do, often you have successive research, that's highlighted, etc. And then all of a sudden it just gathers dust on the shelf. What we were really keen to do was to really develop that momentum and get the NHS to actually act upon that evidence. And essentially, we developed the business case. Now the big challenge was, how do we ensure we impact? How do we change mindsets? And how do we get the right people on board across the NHS to make a difference? But before I talk about that, let me just share with you some headline insights in terms of what we found. In terms of what the NHS does well, 84% said they were open about their disabilities. Now, that was a real surprise to me, because in 1998 I was a personnel manager, and then I became a HR partner, a HR manager, etc. And what I often found was one of the most difficult aspects was dealing with disability and trying to get people to, first of all, line managers on board in terms of what disability means, but also in terms of working with staff members to, first of all, acknowledge they have a disability and in terms of reasonable adjustments, etc. in the future. What we also found was 53% found that their experience was generally good within the NHS, and that there were staff groups generally that were there to help them in terms of from a support perspective. But at the same time, what we also found was that 41% felt their disability had a negative impact in terms of their career progression. And this is where you had that issue of covering. People weren't disclosing. A key issue identified was the whole area around what constitutes disability leave and sick leave, and line managers sometimes not being able to distinguish, or HR not being advising in the right way. And then 16% of those surveyed chose not to declare their disability. But one of the major things that came out of it was, whilst many said that they had supportive managers, HR teams and occupational health arrangements, it was reliant very much on the individual to not only disclose their disability, but also to come with suggestions to how to, undertake their work in line with reasonable adjustments. And that's one of the things I personally found in terms of my career in HR, getting that relationship right between the individual, the line manager, HR and occupational health, and making sure the whole system works. Having done that piece of work, we then decided to engage with Middlesex and Bedfordshire University. What we wanted them to do to build on that business case was to do much more of a quantitative exercise. And so what they did was they looked at the annual staff survey, NHS staff survey, but also linked it with the electronic staff records. Basically, the electronic staff records the personal details of staff, basically, in terms of demographics, etc. Managers looks at also things like leave, career progression, etc., things like that. And what they found was disabled staff felt pressure to come to work even when they were feeling unwell, 11% higher. And there's a big debate around presenteeism within employment in general. In terms of less confident that their trust acted fairly with regard to career progression, that again reconfirmed what we already knew in terms from our previous research as well. But what was really startling was the proportion of disabled staff, 17% in the NHS staff survey disclosed their disability, whilst in contrast, the electronic staff records, only 3% disclosed their disability. So that really told us there was a real need to do some real concerted work around encouraging individuals to disclose their disability. You're playing, the average is 3% in over 400 plus NHS organisations. The NHS employs over 1 million staff, So that really tells you, the enormity of the work that needs to be done around this particular piece of work. There were also real issues around definition of disability, I remember, disability discrimination like 1995, that's over 20 years, but still people having issues around definition of disability. We've talked about conditions for disclosure and also in terms of times of disclosure as well. One of the things that we were also keen to do was to also look at what was the impact in terms of bullying and harassment. 12% higher. If that doesn't give you the business case, I don't know what does. Also, in terms of the other startling thing was, I had often done a lot of work around race equality. I thought the issue around bullying and harassment was bad in terms of race equality. But this was higher compared to all other demographic variables. There was very little in the way of appraisal differences, but 7% fewer disabled staff felt improved their performance, 9% more reported not being valued by their organisation. Okay. But I think these two particular pieces of work, I'd love to spend a good half a day talking through with you the details. But what this has led to has been helping with the business case for disability. And subsequently what's happened is we've been able to develop a series of metrics that I've shared with you. And these are very much in draft form at the moment, and they're out to consultation at the moment. But what we're looking for organisations to do is to report back on these on an annual basis to actually mark progress. Because what we do know is, when we start recording things, people are more likely to make progress on this work. So this is where we are in terms of the NHS. And from a personal perspective, I think I mentioned the work we did around BME disciplinaries in 2008, but this particular piece of work has really galvanised my thinking in terms of where I want to go in terms of my career, etc., and making that impact. And I'm confident that I think these metrics will go some way to help an organisation develop a baseline, but also then start undertaking that development intervention underneath to actually start looking at these figures and making some real progress. You know, because we've always known the legal case for disability, but this very much gives the business case now in terms of what we need to do in the future. Okay. So this is very much a quick overview of the two pieces of work that we've undertaken and the journey that the NHS has taken. This particular piece of metrics will be reported straight to the board on a regular basis, and what we found is when this gets reported to the board, there's more likely to be a lot more actions that happens. But it's a long-term journey. And one of the key things that we are struggling with is obviously data. 3% is a very low figure to work with, and that's very much a key area of work that we need to be really focusing on, as well as working with organisations to develop changing mindsets, you know, to ensure that, you know, there's proper accountability, etc., to see a real movement in terms of this particular piece of work. So happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Very much for that. That was really interesting. When we're looking at disability, that covers a very broad range. Did you get a sense of maybe slight differences depending on the nature of the disability, if it was more obvious, for example, physically or not? Do you think that has a place to bear? Absolutely.
I mean, we've been doing a lot of work around priority of esteem, and in particular trying to encourage organisations to not just address the obvious disabilities in the figures said, but also encourage, have that dialogue, that conversation with members of staff to talk about mental health and on the same level. You know, I used to remember working in an ambulance trust 15 years ago, and we'd often ask paramedics, you know, do you suffer from backache? Because that was a common issue. But we never used to ask, you know, how are you feeling, and tapping into the possibility of individuals possibly suffering from depression, anxiety, etc., and trying to get that on the same agenda as the most obvious ones in terms of physical disability. Yeah. But I think also it's that stigma as well. Sorry. Yeah.
One of the questions about that arises from your presentation, of course, is the complexity of the definition.
Absolutely.
And there's a huge ambiguity, this idea that you can be disabled, you can go in and out of disability. So 6 months, for the past 6 months, or likely to be for the next 6 months. What does it mean to have substantial impact on your ability to carry out day-to-day living? You know, these are really complex areas. And I think a lot of people themselves, I mean, you talk about paramedics who've got chronic back condition. By the definition, that would make them disabled, but they might not realise it.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's part of the problem that we've got right across the workplace, is that people don't understand that definition.
Absolutely. And I think it reminds me of what was said earlier on this morning in terms of how can we talk about the language of diversity so everybody can understand. And one of the things that some organisations in the NHS are doing is developing what we call the staff passport, which is basically around understanding and realising that there's a good chance that we're all going to acquire some form of disability in terms of our employment career, as we're likely to work longer, etc. So encouraging staff members to realise that from an outset, they can then feel part of the discussion, part of the dialogue, etc. And then taking those necessary steps as they progress in terms of their employment career and employment cycle to look at reasonable adjustments, etc. And giving them the confidence to overcome potential stigma, etc. To disclose and work with line managers who are comfortable about taking those challenging issues and working with them so that they stay in employment rather than organisation losing those individuals, or having a member of staff not being able to produce what they should be able to produce, you know.
Okay, so I work in consulting engineering, and these figures really resonate with me.
Yeah.
Our figures are even worse, I would say, in terms of attraction.
Mm-hmm.
But my main focus really now, in terms of my question or comment, is really on the retention side of things when they're actually within the organization. And I think that we're probably not going to see much of an improvement in terms of disability support if we don't have more joined up working between the occupational health line managers and the employees themselves. I think in order for us really, for your sector and mine as well, to see an improvement, we've got to have more joined up working than we have at the moment.
Absolutely. And I fully agree. From personal experience of trying to bring all these different parties together and trying to change the mindset often of line managers and also HR in terms of retaining and not necessarily trying to ease people out of the system, if that makes sense, you know, and seeing individuals as assets, you know, for taking a much more of a strength-based approach rather than looking at what they can't do, but actually what they can do, you know, and that's going to take time. But I do welcome the green paper that recently came out, which, you know, places a real emphasis on retaining people in work, because what we do know is when people stay at work, they're more likely to be more productive in the broadest sense, not just at work but also away from work as well. Okay, question number seven. Oh, sorry. Yeah, a couple of more minutes. Okay.
It was partly an observation.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that organisations seem to be looking at the whole diversity piece, because I think that brings confidence. Mm-hmm. So I'll share a personal example. So I worked for an organisation previously who were going through a massive restructuring, weren't very good around diversity. And I work in diversity. And I was diagnosed with a disability last year. And me working in that field was fearful of disclosing, because I didn't see them in terms of the bigger piece taking diversity seriously. So I was fearful that if I disclosed that I had a disability in the restructure, I was thinking to myself, I could lose my job. They could use this as an excuse to get rid of me.
Yeah.
So I think organisations need to look at the whole picture to build confidence, so that when people are thinking about diversity and disability issues particularly, because we know we have challenges and problems around people disclosing.
Absolutely.
But if they don't feel, I didn't feel confident, and I work in this field, and I've worked in this field for 20 years, and I still felt I can't tell them because they might use this against me.
Absolutely.
So that was quite telling for me.
Absolutely. And I think you're right, and I think one of the things when we've had these consultation events around metrics, some of the suggestions that have been put forward is actually having a measure where staff members are asked, you know, how confident do you feel you can disclose your disability in your organisation, and your organisation will take it seriously? Because that would be a fantastic measure in terms of what the culture, the climate is within the organisation, you know. But I think one of the things that we have learnt from both pieces of work is that people don't fit necessarily in one little box. And trying to get organisations to think about intersectionality, etc. You know, what does it mean in terms of a member of staff who's black, who's maybe disabled, etc. And what does that mean? What in terms of their experience, and bringing it all together rather than in silos. You know. Okay. Oh. Are we okay? Okay then. Thank you very much for your time.